If it was a beautiful secret room in the daytime, it was a boogeyman's pit at night. This is another example of the ways in which nature, while a resource for these women, and while a provider of imagistic language for these women, a psychological or psychic anchor for these women, was also a threat. It was also a nightmarish memory of the realities of slavery. This is an aspect of the subject that I think it's really important for us to see as we consider the complexities of the natural world and also the complexities of relationship.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Lowell Humanities Series. My name is Laurel Semley. I'm Professor of History and Director of the African and African Diaspora Studies program here at Boston College. I am very honored to introduce tonight's speaker, award-winning historian and writer Tiya Miles. She comes to us from Harvard University, where she is the Michael Garvey Professor of History, Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Harvard Radcliffe Center Institute, Director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. She's the author of 8 books and the recipient of numerous awards, honors, fellowships, and prizes, and I can honestly say that there are too many to name. So I will highlight the most notable ones, and you'll understand what I mean in a minute. She is the only 2-time winner of the Yale University Frederick Douglass Prize for the study of slavery, abolition, and resistance. Her 2021 book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, won 11 book awards, including the National Book Award for Nonfiction. She is the recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Mellon New Directions Fellowship. She specializes in 19th century American, African American, Indigenous, and women's history, all told as from a perspective that includes environmental stories and as an interdisciplinary scholar. In this sense, she is a self-described public historian, academic historian, and creative writer. Please join me in welcoming her to Boston College.
I'm going to be talking this evening about enslaved Black women's keen awareness of nature and how that awareness aided them in their quest for dignity and freedom. So I'm going to be offering an argument of sorts that Black women developed personal relationships with features of the natural world and imagined alliances with nature. They saw beauty and possibility in the physical material world around them, and at times they acted on that environmental consciousness, enlisting nature in their efforts to defend against an authoritarian system of enslavement. To take this idea just one beat further, I would say that Black women related to nature with a luminous pragmatism. And this is a term that I adapted from the analysis of eco-theology scholar and historian, the Reverend Dr. Diane Glave, who wrote, quote, African Americans have long envisioned the environment in luminous and evocative ways, while at the same time remaining pragmatic and realistic about the wilderness. So to my mind, this slightly recrafted term, luminous pragmatism, means that Black women saw the beauty and felt the sublime in the natural world, and they also took practical action to buffer or change unjust circumstances by turning nature, even though it was unpredictable, into an ally. This alliance and practical usage included a range of actions, from gathering wild foods and gardening for sustenance, to finding temporary peace of mind beneath a tree or beside a rock, to using nature's remote spots as hiding places in escape attempts. By considering autobiographical and reported accounts of Black women from places ranging as far as Kentucky, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina, depending on how our time goes, we find that nature provided not only physical assistance, but also an interpretive language and a source of emotional affirmation that rendered a kind of psychological and even spiritual anchoring during bad times. Their stories suggest that an acute consciousness of the natural world and accumulated knowledge about how to live in and with it helped enslaved girls and women fight against the physical, spiritual, and psychic threats that slavery posed. And perhaps these attitudes and affinities can help us as well. So now I'm going to move into a description of one of the women whose memoirs or stories we'll be looking at to explore this argument, and that is Margaret Garner. I'm going to read a verse from the poem titled The Slave Mother, Tale of the Ohio, published in 1857, and written by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She fled, and with her children all, she reached the stream and crossed it o'er. Bright visions of deliverance came, like dreams of plenty to the poor. Harper wrote this poem as a reaction to the experience of Margaret Garner, whose life is now very well known because it was fictionalized by Toni Morrison in her novel, Beloved. I see nods. Many of you have read that novel and realized that it was Margaret Garner's story reimagined or retold. Garner was a young woman enslaved in rural Kentucky. And although she was permitted by her owner to wed Robert Garner, an enslaved man in the area, evidence indicates that Margaret Garner was trapped in a long-term sexual relationship with her owner, Archibald Gaines. By the time she turned 22, Margaret was pregnant and already had 4 children, likely fathered by both men, her husband and her owner. In the winter of 1856, during Margaret's pregnancy, Margaret and Robert decided that they wanted to free their family. With Robert's parents and their children, the couple approached the frigid banks of the nearby Ohio River in a horse-drawn wagon that Robert had secretly acquired. The river was frozen over that month, which allowed the fugitive family to cross on foot. After this feat, which would have been impossible in most Midwestern winters, the Garners reached the home of Margaret's free relatives in Ohio. Their reprieve, though, was brutally brief. With armed officers by his side, Archibald Gaines soon stormed the house, backed by the authority of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. What happened next was devastating. Overcome by fear and sorrow at the thought of returning to a state of bondage inheritable by her offspring, Margaret Garner attacked her children. "Before my children shall be taken back to slavery, I will kill every one of them," she reportedly vowed. She took the life of her toddler and injured the others before being restrained by officers. The trial that followed was sensational, and it ended in the conclusion of the court that because Margaret Garner was property and not a person, she wouldn't be held liable for murder. Instead, she was remanded back to her owner, Archibald Gaines, who sold her down south. Margaret Garner lost her life on that ship. It is interpreted, it is believed that she committed suicide by jumping over the side of the ship before her family could be sold further down the river. Soon after this tragic episode occurred, Philadelphia-based African-American writer Frances Allen Watkins Harper composed what was likely the first literary description of this event, which was memorialized in many other ways as well. Harper's poem, titled The Slave Mother, features an enslaved mother fleeing across the frozen river, only to later kill her children to spare them from what Harper calls, quote, a darkly threatened doom. When Harper penned this lyric impression of a slave mother's torment, she drew on environmental details, the water, weather, trees, and sky, as key story elements. Once Harper's slave mother decides to flee, features of the environment appear as reflections of her, that is the mother's, emotional landscape. Harper writes that winter and night were on the earth as the mother begins to flee, and the trees shivered and feebly moaned as she approaches the river, while the breeze murmurs and the winter sighs. These entities, together with, quote, the northern star shining bright, are witness, are witness to the slave mother's hidden desires and daring act. They feel with her, moan with her, and ultimately deliver her into a tragically transitory respite. Frances Harper relies on environmental imagery to articulate the depth of trauma. Just as Margaret Garner and her family depended on an acute awareness of nature, the severe winter and frozen waterway, to enact their initial escape. It is no coincidence that January 28th, 1856, the date of the Garner's flight, was, quote, one of the coldest days on record for Kentucky. Although weather data has only been collected on the Ohio River since 1874, a colloquial record of its freezing patterns in the 19th century exists. Former U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes told the Underground Railroad historian W.H. Siebert in 1893 that in the winters of 1850, 51, 52, 53, 55, and 56, quote, the river was frozen over and crossing made everywhere practicable near Ripley and Cincinnati. Numerous people were able to escape across the Ohio River, treating it as an ice bridge in this period. So here's a story of the environment entwined with the experience of enslavement in a manner that eliminates both domains. Because we have seen a captive woman traverse a reflective landscape with the aid of an ice bridge in Harper's poem, we grasp more feelingly the encasing nature of slavery, the environmental quality of captivity, how natural things mattered to the lives of unfree and subordinated people, and the narrative capacity of natural things to illuminate their interior lives. Similar reference to nature as physical force, descriptive image, and mercurial metaphor drift through Black women's recollections and memoirs like snowflakes. But rarely do we, as historians of the environment or scholars of slavery, pause to catch these translucent words on the tips of our tongues. If we were to sit with narrated remembrances of trauma, we would see authors grappling with unconscionable loss and finding in their fragile environments tools of material resistance, sources of emotional sustenance, and language for expressing the unspeakable. Experiences in and with nature shaped Black women's daily lives and colored their tales of captivity, even as the stories they told about slavery reveal a persistent environmental mindfulness. They found in their fragile environments tools of resistance. They also found a language that is naturalistic description for expressing the unspeakable. Experiences in and with nature shaped their experience and shaped the way their experiences come to us. So now I'm going to move into another example, and that is of Harriet Jacobs, whose narrative I am guessing many of you in this room had read, and I see nods. Well, I read Jacobs' narrative too when I was in college back in the 1990s, and this was very soon after the literary historian Jean Fagan Yellen had recovered Harriet Jacobs' narrative and did the very detailed, meticulous on-the-ground work to authenticate it as being Jacobs' story and not being written by an abolitionist in Jacobs' time period. A couple of years ago, a church in Cambridge called First Church decided to commission a portrait of Harriet Jacobs. And they were having an unveiling ceremony of this portrait. The sanctuary was full, and there were panelists there to talk about Harriet Jacobs. I was among them. And we were all sitting here prepared to speak. And the portrait made of Jacobs that had been newly done, commissioned, was over there. Not a person around it. It was on an easel. It had been stationary for many, many minutes as people came into the room and people said a welcome, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden, it seemed as if the portrait leapt off the easel. It just kind of seemed to jump. And everybody in the church was kind of jumped too, recognizing this had happened. And there was a minister who's also a divinity school professor who was on the panel as well, who intimated, yeah, that's Jacobs. She has something to say to us. And many people have read her narrative and are recited her narrative in classes. Typically, discussions of Harriet Jacobs' narrative focus on her experience as an enslaved girl and woman who faced harrowing sexual harassment and probably, though she doesn't say it, sexual assaults. I'm guessing that if you read her in class, you also talked about the way in which she hid for almost 7 years in a tiny little space in the garret of a shed next to her grandmother's home, the ways in which she masterminded an incredibly complex escape for herself and her children, and the ways in which she then criticized racism in the North and published her narrative. These are all very important features of the narrative. But one thing that I found as I was thinking about the scene of Black women in nature is that Harriet Jacobs' narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is full of that similar kind of natural descriptive language that I just shared with you that we see in Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's poetry. I went through and tried to do kind of a content analysis of incidents to see what I could pull out of it that would be references to nature. And the book was just full of natural imagery and natural metaphors and natural comparatives. I found that Harriet Jacobs marks the presence of nature literally and figuratively. And she tends to talk about these aspects of nature in this order in terms of the number of appearances: water, wind, sunshine, starlight, woods, dirt, vines, fruit, and the overall atmosphere. So Jacobs writes about rivers and swamps serving as escape routes and hiding places. She writes about woods and trees offering shade, being places of rest and spaces of sacred ritual, as well as shields against the scrutiny of enslavers. She describes Black women, quote, hiding themselves in woods and swamps to evade slave patrols. And she talks about enslaved people going to, quote, their little church in the woods with their burying ground around it. She also describes her own escape and talks about how when she was hiding out in the very dank, snaky swamp, that the captain of the secret ship who was going to help her cross the water into free territory said that the swamp is a slave territory that defies all the laws. This is an idea that Jacobs puts forward, quoting the captain, that I think we can apply to an understanding of Black women's experiences in nature while enslaved. And that is that nature create spaces where the law can be defied or evaded. That nature seems to take precedence or to have more power than the laws of human beings. I also saw in this content analysis of Instance Life of a Slave Girl that Harriet Jacobs uses the sky and the sun and the clouds quite a lot to describe experiences, especially of feminized individuals in her community. So she's looking at women and girls and how it is they compare to one another, and she uses the sky as a way to describe this. Here's a quote that I bet you've read or talked about in your classes. It's a really important one from Incidents where Jacobs is trying to explain how it is that a white girl growing up who is beautiful will face wonderful choices and lovely days, but a black girl growing up who is beautiful will face quite the opposite. So we have that idea in mind, but listen to it and pay attention to how Jacobs uses nature in this quote. She's talking about two young girls approaching sexual maturity, and she says, for the white beauty, quote, from childhood to womanhood, her pathway was blooming with flowers and overarched by a sunny sky. Scarcely one day of her life had been clouded when the sun rose on her bridal morning. But how had those days dealt with her slave sister, the little playmate of her childhood? She also was very beautiful, but the flowers and sunshine of love were not for her. She drank the cup of sin and shame and misery, wherever persecuted race are compelled to drink. So here we see Jacobs using the sky to help us understand something that she cannot talk about directly in her time period and in her position, and that is the reality of sexual threat and sexual violation that Black enslaved girls and women faced. And there's another moment when Jacobs talks about the sky that really caught my attention in this narrative. It's really quite beautiful, and I think of it as an ode to the risen sun. It says after she has escaped, Jacob says, I called Fanny, a woman who had escaped with her, to see the sunrise for the first time in our lives on free soil. We watched the reddening sky and saw the great orb come up slowly out of the water, as it seemed. Soon the waves began to sparkle, and everything caught the beautiful glow. Before us lay the city of strangers. We looked at each other, and the eyes of both were moistened with tears. So Jacobs reaches for this language of daily rhythms and the patterns of the planet to describe an experience that in other moments might actually leave her speechless. Sunlight floods Jacob's memory in this instance when she's describing the first moment of freedom. But we also see through her complex narrative that darkness, a dark sky, we heard the example of a cloudy sky, is also a common feature, even a dominant feature of enslaved people's lives. So her account is not all sunshine and flowers. It is also cloud, storm, rain, weed. Nature can be a balm and nature can be a safe haven, but nature can also be quite dangerous, and it can also be the place where people come to the end of their lives. Here's an example from Jacobs of this. She's describing a woman who's running away, and she says, I saw a woman rush wildly by, pursued by two men. She was a slave, the wet nurse of the mistress's children. For some trifling offense, her mistress ordered her to be stripped and whipped. To escape the degradation and the torture, she rushed to the river, jumped in, and ended her wrongs in death. So we see in this narrative that nature can be an ally to live, to live a life that has dimensions of joy, even within the suffering and the loss. But nature can also be a means by which enslaved people in their lives. There's sunshine and there's cloud. There's lightness and there's darkness in the ways in which Harriet Jacobs uses nature. I ended up in a recent book of mine, Wild Girls, talking about Harriet Jacobs as a nature writer, trying to kind of reframe her in our minds because of the ways in which she writes about her experience. I want now, connected to Jacobs, to offer another example. This one will be shorter. And it comes from the narrative of a formerly enslaved girl, a Black woman, named Kate Drumgold. This narrative was called A Slave Girl's Story. It was published rather late in comparison to Jacobs. So it was published in 1898, whereas Jacobs published in 1861. Drumgold in this narrative is thinking back to her enslavement in Virginia right before the Civil War. And she recounts how her mother was sold away from her and her siblings. I'm going to read you that quote and then bring in an example of how nature figures into Kate Drumgold's telling. Kate Drumgold writes, "My dear mother was sold at the beginning of the war from all of her little ones after the death of the lady she belonged to, and who was so kind to my dear mother and all the rest of the Negroes on this place. The money that my mother was sold for was to keep the rich man from going to the field of battle, as he sent a poor white man in his stead." So you hear what happened there, that Kate Drumgold's mother was sold by the family in order to enable the man of the household to get enough money to pay a white man with lesser means, so a working class white man, to fight in his place in the Civil War. Lots of levels of relationship there across racial and class lines. But what I really want us to focus on is that when Kate Drumgold's mother was sold away from her, Kate remembered that, quote, "the saddest thought was to me to know which way she had gone." So Kate didn't know where her mother had gone, and this thought of not knowing plagued her. She wrote, "I used to go outside and look up to see if there was anything that would direct me. And I saw a clear place in the sky, and it seemed to me the way she had gone. And I watched it 3.5 years, not knowing what that meant. And it was there the whole time my mother was gone from her little ones." So a small example that I share with you to show how Drumgold's remembering herself as a child, missing her mother, alone and afraid, desperately wanting to know where has her mother gone, and then kind of latching onto a spot in the sky, a space in the sky that she as a child imagines just stays there, that it's constant, that it never moves. Well, this is impossible because the sky is constantly changing, and so would Kate have been across the landscape. But this clear spot represents, I think, a psychic reassurance to her that she imagined in the sky. And then after the Civil War, Kate Drumgold's mother did an amazing thing. She successfully located her children and reunited with them. When Kate remembers this moment, she also uses language that brings in the real presence of nature. She says, "On one bright Sunday, I asked my older sister to go with me for a walk. And we saw some sweet flowers on the wayside, and we began to have delight in picking them, when all at once I was led to leave her alone with the flowers and to go where I could look up at that nice, clear spot. And as I wanted to get as near to it as I could, I got up on the fence, and as I looked that way, I saw a form coming to me that looked like my dear mother's." So the clear spot delivered her mother back to her. I think this is so beautiful and so telling as a way for us to get an understanding of how it is that enslaved girls, enslaved women, enslaved people coped with the deep traumas of enslavement, how they turned to nature to help them to interpret their experience and to survive into the next day, when perhaps there would be a turn of fate that could reunite them with a loved one. I am assuming that you all know a fair amount about Harriet Tubman, so I'm not going to fill in a ton of detail. I will just remind you that she is one of the most lauded figures of the abolition movement. She was enslaved herself in Maryland on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. She managed to escape her enslavement in 1849. And after that time, she returned back to Maryland approximately 12 times and physically, directly helped around 70 people to escape. The information she shared and the routes she mapped out were shared with probably 200 to 300 additional people, which broadens the circle of those who were aided by her efforts. And then during the Civil War in 1863, in that summer in the Cumberland River Raid, she helped Union forces free an additional 700 plus enslaved people who were running from the rice plantations on that river. There are, by now, many memorials to Harriet Tubman. There are statues. A new one just went up in South Carolina. There is also the fairly new Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park and Visitor Center in Maryland, right next to the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. And if you haven't been there, I really encourage you to go. It's a beautifully imagined site which attempts to bring the wildlife refuge, which is right next door, you can see it through the window, into the interpretation of Harriet Tubman's life. But as I write in my recent biography of Harriet Tubman, her most fitting memorial is one that grows from the ground. And this is a tree. In the early 1900s, in Auburn, New York, members of her family planted a testament in her honor. Judith Bryant, a great-grandniece of Tubman, said, quote, "The children planted a small tree in Fort Hill. They thought it was a small Christmas tree and would stay forever small. And it is now the tallest tree in the cemetery. It's a Norway spruce, and it's the landmark for the grave of Harriet Tubman." If you ever go to Fort Hill Cemetery, you will not have trouble finding Harriet Tubman's tree. It really is the tree that towers over them all. And I say this is fitting because Harriet Tubman seems to have gravitated toward trees since she was a very young person. The environmental sociologist Rosita Taylor has noted that Tubman, quote, "reveled in solitude and used it as a space for contemplation when she was alone in the woods." Tubman's affinity with forest made her own escape from slavery possible, and it gave her the knowledge and information that she needed to help many other people free themselves. Harriet Tubman's young life was harrowing. She experienced trauma after trauma, as did her siblings, who were the children of Britt Green and Ben Ross. This couple had come together when the people who owned them married, and even though their owners were coupled, Britt Green and Ben Ross were separated because their owners would often send them out, lease them out to other people in the area. And they did the same with the children of Britt and Ben, including Harriet Tubman. The children rarely got to spend long periods of time with their parents, but nonetheless, this was a very close-knit family, which by all accounts that we can read in the record was full of love and support for one another. I'm going to skip past Harriet Tubman's youngest childhood and talk about the injury that she had when she was an adolescent, early adolescent, and then her experience working in the woods right after that. Are you all familiar with Harriet Tubman's blow to the head, her brain injury? Lots of nods, yes. This was a transformative moment in her life. She was probably around age 12, and she had been leased out to another man in the area, whom she describes as the worst man in the neighborhood. She and the cook on that farm or plantation had been sent to the nearby general store to get supplies, and while they were there, a very young Harriet Tubman, whose name then was Minty Ross, saw that a young black boy or black teen was running away from the overseer. When the boy ran into the store with the overseer behind him, Harriet Tubman says in her recollections of the event that she got in between the boy and the overseer, so that when the overseer picked up a heavy weight, which was then used for measuring out goods for purchase, this weight was around 3 to 5 pounds, and threw it at the boy, it hit Harriet Tubman in the head, knocked her to the ground. She lost consciousness, and after that time, she had an injury that gave her very intense and terrible headaches for the rest of her life, and that caused her to lose consciousness randomly at any given time, and even in periods as close to 15 minutes apart. Scholars now who look back at this moment in Tubman's life describe her condition as probably being temporal lobe epilepsy that she may have suffered from as a result of this injury. The headaches that she lived with were so terrible that, according to letters that we have by abolitionists who knew her, when Tubman was a woman in her 70s, living in Upper New York, she was visiting Boston, and she walked into what is now Mass General and begged the surgeons to perform an operation to try to save her from the terrible pain of those headaches. So this moment in her life was transformative. It meant that she was going to be going forward as a young enslaved girl with an injury and with chronic pain, which many scholars have described as a disability. And I also follow in this vein, borrowed from the example of Deirdre Cooper Owens. After Tubman suffered from this injury and this disability, she was put to work in the woods, working for a man who had a logging operation. She was just a teenage girl, and she was the only girl or woman doing this work on this crew. And here are some ways in which people who knew Tubman, who heard her tell her story, describe this period of her life. They say that as a teenage girl, that's my language, Tubman, quote, drove oxen, carted, plowed, cut wood, and hauled logs, performing Herculean tasks. And they also said, quote, the labor of the horse and the ox, the lifting of barrels and flour and other heavy weights were given to her. While doing this heavy work, we need to remember that Tubman would sometimes be falling to the ground with a seizure, being unconscious for many minutes, and also dealing with terrible headaches. In this period of her life, she, in addition, had frightful dreams that would keep her up at night, and also waking visions that were quite terrifying. She had a recurring dream of her 2 sisters being taken away from her family and sold further south, which actually did happen. And she had dreams of a bird flying over a really interesting geography to freedom. During this time, Tubman realized that she might be able to negotiate with her enslaver to allow her to hire her own time out, and she did this. She was able to make a little bit of money then, because the money that she earned was divided between her enslaver, who got most of it, and her. She got a little bit of it, but she used the money that she got to purchase a pair of oxen, which increased her productivity enabled her to earn a bit more, which she used to hire an attorney to investigate her mother's history, because she suspected that her mother was being held in slavery wrongfully. That ended up to be the case. That her mother should have been freed years before, based on a provision of the will of their enslaver's father. But somehow their enslaver didn't notice that portion of the will, or didn't act on it. So in this period when she was able to hire herself out, Tubman spent quite a lot of time in those woods. And she worked under the leadership and the mentorship of her father, Ben Ross, because he was an expert woodsman who had been working in the logging industry, first as an enslaved man and then as a free man for many years. So it is to Tubman's father that many scholars give the credit for Tubman's deep understanding of the woods. People who knew Tubman, who spoke with her later in life, said that nature, being outdoors, seems to have made her disability and her pain lessen. That being outdoors seems to have made it a little bit easier for her to bear, and speculate that maybe this is why Tubman, when she could hire her own self out, hired herself out into the woods, into the pursuit of logging. Here's a quote from one of Tubman's associates. She said, this is Edna Dow Cheney, "The blow produced a disease of the brain which was severe for a long time and still makes her very lethargic. She cannot remain quiet 15 minutes without appearing to fall asleep. It is not refreshing slumber, but a heavy, weary condition which exhausts her. She therefore loves great physical activity and direct heat of the sun, which keeps her blood actively circulating." So we don't have these words from Tubman's lips. We don't know exactly how Tubman would have described her physical experience and what it was like for her to be outside. But it does seem through her actions that we can see that she was trying to put herself outside as often as she could. And later on in her life, Tubman says about this period that the Lord was getting her fitted for the work. So she later came to see this outdoor time as a period of training and education that was divinely ordained or divinely orchestrated so that she could be an effective helper to enslaved people as they escaped through the woods. So now I'm going to move forward to my final example before I close. This example comes from a relatively more recent memoir. It's from the memoir of Mamie Garvin Fields, who was an educator in the Charleston, South Carolina area. I see some nods, Professor Connors nodding. And who wrote an as told to memoir with her granddaughters, which is called Lemon Swamp and Other Places, a Carolina memoir, published in 1983. Now, even though Mamie Garvin Fields was able to tell her story, to co-produce her story in 1983, which seems fairly recent, she is someone who had a direct family memory of enslavement. And she talks about this memory in the book Lemon Swamp. She describes how in the summer, her middle-class, educated Black family would go to Lemon Swamp, which was a rural spot, not in the coastal area, but more toward the interior of the area around Charleston. And they spent time at a place that the grandfather of the family got only by squatting there after those who had enslaved him fled during the Civil War. So he squatted there, and he assumed a kind of informal ownership of this place that the family began to think of as their home place. And Mamie Fields loved this place in many ways. She describes it beautifully in her memoir that she writes with her granddaughters. She says, for example, all kinds of wild things grew in Lemon Swamp. Tall, sweet-smelling pine trees, huge live oaks that touch one another over the road, ferns of every shape growing close to the water, other plants growing right in the water. She says that she watched birds there and all kinds of little animals, and that the trees and bushes threw shadows like curtains around her so that it felt like a room. So a beautiful memory of a childhood in this outdoor place. But by the end of her description of this wetland area, Mamie Garvin Fields reveals something that she withholds from the reader for many pages. And that is, quote, "My grandmother was lost in Lemon Swamp and was never seen again." She then recounts the story of how her grandmother was lost. And the story is that her grandmother and grandfather were enslaved at Lemon Swamp. And when their enslavers feared that Sherman and his army might march by, they determined they were going to flee. They directed Fields's grandmother to tend to their children as they were fleeing, and left behind Fields's grandfather and the children of Fields's family. So she remembers that her grandfather would tell the story of how he begged their owner to please don't take his wife. Please leave his wife with him and to care for their small babies. But the owner ignored this and took the grandmother away. And this was how she was lost at Lemon Swamp. This is the last place that anyone ever saw Mamie Garvin Fields' grandmother. So by the time she recounts this traumatic story about the separation of her family at this place of beauty and this place of return, she says, "If it was a beautiful secret room in the daytime, it was a boogeyman's pit at night." This is another example of the ways in which nature, while a resource for these women, and while a provider of imagistic language for these women, a psychological or psychic anchor for these women, was also a threat. It was also a nightmarish memory of the realities of slavery. This is an aspect of the subject that I think it's really important for us to see as we consider the complexities of the natural world and also the complexities of relationship. So now I want to conclude by reading to you the last paragraph of the talk that I hope will bring together some of these threads. Enslaved women's environmental consciousness was not just practical, but also cultural and political. Discussing these stories of slavery and nature may offer lessons for our own time. We exist in the condition of having degraded most of the planet, and this status quo will worsen as environmental protections are unraveled at the federal level. Enslaved women encountered and intimately interacted with the similarly ravaged plantation landscape. They inflicted damage as the exploited labor force that was compelled to clear woods, weed rice, pick cotton, and harvest tobacco on depleted, eroding soils. And yet they found hope in these same stretches of tender acreage. Through their states of exhaustion and suffering, they turned to that same compromised nature for spiritual and emotional replenishment, or what Frances Harper described as a, quote, hope of deliverance. Enslaved Black women were a ransacked people, surviving on a ransacked earth. Their stories encourage us to approach our damaged world and this difficult time with a sense of luminous pragmatism, sifting out ways to live with grace on a traumatized Black and blue planet. Thank you very much, you all, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Miles, for such a stirring talk. We have a little time for questions.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking to us
Hi.
today. It was lovely hearing about this topic, especially one that I don't think is discussed enough. So I'm just curious, like on a personal note, how did you become you, and how did you first discover the connection between Black women, especially enslaved Black women, and I guess their connection to nature?
Thank you for being here, and thank you for that question. It took me a while, which is really strange because it's all around us. It was all around me. It was everywhere through their texts. I think it has so much to do with where we focus our attention and what we overlook. The first time, I think this is the first time, that I realized the integral connection between enslaved people and nature, which was the first step that I made, was when I was trying to understand better the history of an enslaved man in the Cherokee Nation in what is now Georgia. His name was Isaac. Isaac had been owned by a Cherokee family known as the Vans, and he ran away a few different times, only returning to try to rescue his wife, at which point he was caught, and he was hanged on a live oak. We have another one of these oak trees on the plantation. So this incident and descriptions of Isaac's life appeared in the records of Moravian missionaries who lived on the plantation as well and who operated a school for Cherokee children. A very one-sided set of reflections, though really helpful for trying to get any kind of a sense of who Isaac was or what he experienced or what the enslaved community experienced there. When I went to this plantation and had the chance to walk the grounds with the rangers who worked there and passed by a really large oak tree that looked to be quite old, I made the connection between the landscape, the tree, and that missionary record. And I asked the ranger if this could have been the tree where Isaac's life was taken from him, and she said that she thought it was. That was a light bulb moment for me, because I realized that sometimes we can find as much information in the landscape and in the natural world as we can in the written record when it comes to enslaved people and other subordinated groups. And once we can make that step, we have the chance to begin to see into their lives in a different way. So I started to think about Isaac and this tree, and whether he had spent time with that tree before, whether he had ever pressed his body against that tree willingly. And it opened up just a whole new consciousness, I guess, for thinking about his experience and other experiences on that plantation.
I was wondering if in your reading there were any images of nature which seemed especially recurrent, or if you found that it differed more on a person-by-person basis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. Yes, there were images that recurred across narratives. And I just talked about women's narratives, but I also keep notes on men's narratives. I just haven't written about their narratives yet in this vein. There are lots of similarities. I would say that the dominant feature is probably water in close competition with the woods across all these narratives. Because water is well, first of all, it's necessary for anybody to live. Many of the locations where people are enslaved are adjacent to waterways. And of course, water can be a route to safety if a person manages to escape, but it can also be quite dangerous. I gave an example of a suicide, but there are also examples of drownings. I'm actually working with a graduate student right now whose dissertation is all on drownings that enslaved people suffered while working on waterways. So rivers, creeks, swamps are all really significant recurring images of nature and features of nature that come up.
So in your talk, like, you covered a bunch of narratives of people that either had been like fictionalized, like you mentioned with Toni Morrison, or well-known narratives like Harriet Tubman. But is there a particular story that you've come across that like you wish was more popular, or wish more people were familiar with, and like maybe if people were familiar with it, you could like communicate more effectively? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And thank you for that. Here's the first thing that occurred to me, right? I hesitate to say it because of the way it's going to sound. But yes, I did, and I wrote a book about it. And the book is called All That She Carried. And it's about, well, you already heard about it from Professor Assembly. It's about a line of Black enslaved women in South Carolina and Philadelphia who experienced a separation through a sale, and who recorded their family memories by embroidering that story onto a cotton sack. So I would say that, first of all. I also would probably share this. I have published about this, but in the chapter at the end of a short book, and then I think maybe also in an essay. So I haven't written a full-length piece about it. And that is, that if we look at interviews that were conducted with formerly enslaved people during the Works Progress Administration, so these are known as the WPA interviews. I see lots of nods and people who know what that is. That's great. You could also track these elements of nature there, which I have tried very hard to do. So I did write about how many enslaved people witnessed the 1833 Leonid meteor shower, and we can see that in these narratives. But I also started tracking in these narratives descriptions of swamp gas. And the reason why is because swamp gas is often viewed as or said to be a sign of hauntings and ghosts in the South on ghost tours. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see if enslaved Black people, looking back on their lives, see something in the swamps that looks something like, swamp gas that they thought was haunted. And I did find some examples of that, which I found, quite interesting. It's not just a modern phenomenon. And it is not just a phenomenon of non-Black people who have ghost tours who are talking about swamp gases. Enslaved people saw these swamps. Oh, we're back to the swamps. Where'd you go? There you are. We're back to the swamps and to the waterways. Enslaved people saw them as being haunted too, or places that you had to be really careful of.
Thank you so much for being here. This was really important, and I think the work that you're doing really highlights how important it is to look for intimacies in a really limited archive. I'd be really curious to hear more about how engaging with this archive and these stories has shifted your relationship with nature, and if you could just speak more about what you think we all have to learn from these narratives, and from this kind of like knowledge with nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to take part B first. There's so many things that I think we could learn from these narratives, and I think that we should be contemplating and studying, in our classes. But I would say right now, what I think these narratives can offer us, and the reason why I want to talk about them, is because we see people who are living in times that are arguably, and I actually think they are, less chaotic and less destructive. Wait, I said the wrong direction. I meant the opposite. More chaotic, and more destructive than ours. But they still were able to think about things, take actions, write about their situations, analyze what was going on around them, and to take really great risks to try to pursue what they thought was right. In their case, they thought that freedom was right. To me, these examples are reassuring because they tell me that people who had it worse were still able to see the potential for their own agency. Where the nature piece comes in is, it seems to me that in doing that, they were very willing and able to look for help. They didn't just think, I'm going to do it all on my own. I didn't mention this, but this is part of my focus in my biography of Tubman. So we think of her as a lone figure. She wasn't. She never talks about herself as being alone. And some of the figures or entities or beings that she thought of herself as being with were aspects of nature, so like the stars, the trees, and so on. If we could adopt that kind of sensibility, recognizing that things may be quite dark, but we can still move. That was Tubman, escaping at night. And recognizing that we may feel alone, but we actually never are. That was Tubman, looking up at the stars. I think that we will all be heartened for the path ahead. Okay, thanks so much, you all.